This has actually really been a great honor to be able to start after David. So good morning, everyone. It's a really great honor to be here in such a distinguished company, and I'm here to present the paper AI in the Newsroom, Defining Journalism as an Outsider, which I've been working on together with my colleagues Martin Kjellman here from the University of Helsinki and Carl-Gustav Lindén, who is one of my supervisors. It's a little bit daunting to be going out first, but let's see how this goes. So our study originates in a research project here at the University of Helsinki, Immersive Automation, where we studied how to create NLG systems, natural language generation systems, for news and to explore the usability of these systems for news. And from there on, we wanted to venture beyond the newsroom to talk to the people that design, build, and sell natural language generation technologies that are incorporated into news journalism. So 9 companies took part in the interviews where we asked them to recount a project where they had worked with a news organization. And our approach is stemming from a critical data studies perspective, seeing these systems as socio-technical systems. And here is an overview that I tried to draw this morning about how these systems worked based on our interviews. And the point being here is that these systems are actually set up quite differently depending on company and depending on contexts. And these companies work as software as a service, they work as platform as a service, and even content as a service. Some work together with news organizations as well to locate data, because news organizations don't always have data sets ready that they come with to these companies. And this is a backdrop to have in mind when considering how these technologies see their role in the context of news journalism. So we wanted to talk to these technologists because their perspective has been studied to a lesser extent as of yet. NLG has been studied quite a lot from audience perspectives, for example, and from newsroom management perspectives. But we wanted to bring more studies to the table where we actually talk to technologists. There has been studies done by Carlsson and Dörr and Wu et al. And Kunert lately in 2020, for example. And we hope that this study will then add to this body of research. And we also wanted to look at the role that these companies have in reshaping news work, because as their systems have to have a nose for news, so to say, they have to interact with journalism and they have to interact with news organizations. And just the same way as platforms currently are reconsidering and considering the concept of newsworthiness, so do these companies. And also they have to discuss with the customers how to find ways to fit into existing formats and to fit into existing distribution systems. So we were interested in how these technologists see themselves in relation to journalism, the role of their product in journalism, and how they actually view the whole concept of journalism. So I'm not going to go into details on automated journalism because I think most of you are quite well versed in it, and there will be many more presentations on the topic today. But we identified 11 companies doing NLG for news, and 9 agreed to take part in the study. And we used semi-structured interviews where we have an interview guide where we asked the interlocutors to recount a project where they had been working together with the news organizations. And we tried to nudge them to talk about something that they actually had done and how they had talked with them, and not so much what they say that they would do, in order to kind of, increase the validity of what they were talking about. And we had 5 themed questions with flexible sub-questions, which were designed so they could be, allowing for the fact that the companies did differ in how they worked. They differed in how the project looked, and they differed also in which stage of actually doing these projects they were. And we usually talked with them for about a bit more than an hour. So they're actually quite rich interviews that we have. And then we did a thematic analysis of the interview materials where we used institutional logics, a theoretical framework. And institutional logics is a broad meta-theory originating in studies of organizations and institutionalism. And it is a quite complex and dense theory. So we used parts of it. And it was suggested for us as it is useful for understanding how people from different institutional contexts interact, which is what is happening when technologists and journalists meet, because they usually reside in different logics of understanding the world. And institutional logics is a flexible, non-functional approach, arguing that identities, values, and assumptions of both individuals and organizations are embedded in prevailing logics of that particular context. So in this study, we use this framework for understanding how the technologists define their own logics by juxtaposing it with how they define the logics of journalists. So in order to be able to identify and theorize these logics that they see for themselves, we used concepts from Thornton, Ocasio, and Lounsbury's book from 2012, where they argue that logics emerge and are extracted through the building block of theories, frames, and narratives. And theories originate from larger societal level logics, such as market logics, for example, and provide guiding principles, whereas frames are more concrete, they're more explicitly expressed and help individuals create shared understanding. And narratives are shared stories that aid in collective sense-making and aid in legitimizing these identities that they have in these logics. So in addition to that, we looked at instances where logics appeared to compete and also where technologists assimilated parts of journalistic logics. So the prevailing theory among these technologists was one of rationalization. The use of AI, in this case NLG, it is inevitable in order to make news organizations more efficient and for them to survive in what is perceived as a crisis of journalism. And this efficiency logic is interestingly the same regardless of customer. So they have the same theory for an e-commerce company, for journalism, or for business insights, for example. The main theory is that resources are scarce and AI should be used to maximize output. And also, they are of the opinion that news organizations should adopt business models from tech companies. And they see journalism as a product which audiences should want to buy. And the frames are explicitly expressed in order to have this shared understanding of an issue and event. And in this case, how NLG and AI relates to journalism. And this is really strongly connected to a normative ideal of what journalism should be. It should be investigative, it should be deep, it should be scoops, it should be personalized. It should be different from what it is at the moment. And AI can help. And they imagine journalism as highly important, and AI can make it better by optimizing newswork. So they see themselves as having a role in aiding news journalism by making it better, by improving newswork, and it's all about volume, speed, access, availability. And importantly here, there is ambiguity in how they connect the ideas of seeing journalism as both a product and as public service. And then the narrative, which is a familiar one of journalists and news organizations as difficult customers. And as narratives are these shared stories that aid in collective sense-making and legitimizing identities that can actually be quite important in seeing how these technologists communicate with each other through, conferences and so on, where they're actually talking about newsrooms and news organizations. And this narrative of journalists as resisting change, which is quite common in, for example, journalism studies, is not as clear-cut in these interviews as is often portrayed, because news organizations and journalists are actually, seen as more difficult than other customers. At the same time, they're also seen as wanting to have these products. They're seen as being innovative, as having plenty of ideas of how to use NLG as a technology. The problem is that they don't always understand what it can be used for. And the technologists don't really feel that they want to open up how this technology works that much to these news organizations. So there is a clash in understanding. But these, interestingly as well, that these technologies actually quite rarely tend to meet journalists. They meet editors, they meet management, they meet business people, but they rarely actually meet journalists. And also journalism does, differ from, for example, designing business insights or e-commerce. So there is also like this format difference. And this brings us to the end of the presentation, which is talking about, for example, competing logics and assimilation. And competing logics is something which does occur because the technologists view themselves staunchly as outsiders, even though many of them actually have touching points with journalism in their own personal history. Some of them have worked as journalists, they have been trained as journalists. But they should really have a staunch viewpoint of what journalists should be, how journalists should work, and how newsworthiness should be defined and so on. But they also assimilate parts of journalistic logics into their own logics of how they actually work and how they design their products, which has to do with quality requirements of news, accountability, correctness, form, ethical issues, and so on. Also, The technologists, through these interactions with news organizations, recognize their own limitations this way, meaning that they really kind of shape their identity by being in meetings with these news organizations. So concluding, news is for most of these companies not a profitable endeavor. It is something that they do because they feel it's important and because it helps them advance their products. It gives these products rigor, so it's used as a way to benchmark these tools and solutions to find new potential customers. And when content is moved to NLG, as it is, for example, in sports news, the generated news tend to lose their value as journalism. It's reconceptualized as information. And in the same way, the tasks that are performed are redefined as non-journalistic tasks, which is a quite important thing when thinking about how AI is affecting newswork. And the study is, of course, limited because we only talk to 9 companies, only from one representative from one company. Also, these technologies evolve incredibly fast. So these interviews from 2019 already, in a sense, are old. But we really do hope that this study can work as a starting point for looking further at these AI companies and how they are working with journalism, and using also a critical perspective to look at how these technologies are impacting on newswork. Because one of the questions that I at least was thinking about is that when you are extracting, thinking about outliers, when you're extracting ways of, working with newsworthiness, what actually, in a sense, is then limiting these companies from becoming distributors in their own sense? Why at some point they actually might not need any more of these news organizations in order to be able to distribute their content. So that was it. Thank you for being here, and hopefully this was a clear and understandable presentation. Thank you so much.